Hey, welcome to Riverside. Today I have a question for you, and that is, what is your calling? What is your calling? I want you to put it down in the comments. And the reason for that is because this is a question that a lot of people have wrestled with, trying to find their calling, trying to find what they're supposed to do in life. And if they see how you found your calling and how you've maybe fulfilled your calling, maybe it might help them too. But we'll be talking about calling today. And this is the third lesson in a three-part series. If you look back on the videos on my YouTube channel, you'll see the first one was about our purpose. What is our purpose? And we talked about how our purpose for as mankind is to simply sit at the feet of Jesus, is to simply know God. Before we get to washing people's feet, before we get to helping the poor and the sick, before we get to spreading the gospel even, it all starts with simply knowing God. And I don't mean knowing about God. I mean knowing God on a deep and intimate level. The second lesson we talked about, if you look at the YouTube archive, we talked about what is our mission. And we talked about the Great Commission. And then we looked to Acts 2 to see how the Great Commission began to be fulfilled at this exact moment in Acts 2, the day of Pentecost. It's a really unique moment where, the Great Commission was first kind of started. And this week we're talking about calling. And what you'll notice is that your calling kind of flows from your mission, and your mission flows from our purpose. And what I mean by that is our purpose is to know God. And once we know God, it's our mission then is to point people to God. It's hey, we have this we have this great news, the gospel. We have this amazing thing where we can be one with God again. Let's tell the world about it. That's our mission. And our calling kind of flows from our mission. It's how has God led you to fulfill that mission in your own personal life? And so we're talking about our calling today. And one thing that I really want to focus on is really the character of Moses. And the reason that I want to focus on the character of Moses is because Moses, when he first starts his mission, or when he first starts going about the task that God gave him, he was actually very reluctant. He was very reluctant to follow through. And it's not until he actually gave 4 excuses that he finally submitted and then started carrying out the task that God gave him. And so if you look at Moses, if you look at Exodus chapter 3, you'll see where Moses at this point, he's been raised as an Egyptian royalty. He's murdered somebody. He went on the run, met his wife, met his father-in-law. He's now shepherding his father-in-law's sheep. And he as he's out shepherding sheep, he stumbles upon something that catches his eye. And it's this bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And I love that, because in order to notice that the burning bush wasn't being consumed, you had to have stopped and watched it for a second. You had to have stopped and observed it for a moment. And so he notices that this burning bush was on fire but wasn't being consumed. He goes further, and as he goes further, he hears Moses, Moses, take off your sandals. This is holy ground. So he takes off his sandals, and he has this conversation with God. I would pay so much money just to be a fly on the wall during this conversation. But they have this conversation. And in this conversation, God tells Moses, you are going to confront Pharaoh, and long story short, you're going to lead my people out of Israel. You're going to lead them to the promised land, this land flowing with milk and honey, and it's going to be you who lead the people out of the promise, out of Egypt. At first, it's interesting. He doesn't say that you're going to confront Pharaoh and tell him to free the Israelites. He says just confront Pharaoh and tell him we want 3 days where we can go and worship our God in the wilderness. And God says, Pharaoh's not going to submit to that. He's not going to be okay with that. And it's not until I lay my hand on Egypt and perform all these miracles that finally finally he'll release you. And not only will he release you, but upon your release, the Israelites will talk to the Egyptian people, and the Egyptian people will give them gold and jewelry and clothing, and that's how you'll plunder the Egyptians, not through conquest, not through battle and war, but just because of God's power. Now, in this conversation, Moses, like I said, gives 4 excuses as to why he's not the guy to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. The first one comes from Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. And we'll go there right now. Chapter 3, verse 11. At this point, God has told Moses that he's going to do all this. And Moses asked God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" In other words, it's like Moses is saying, like, I'm not enough. I'm not enough. And this is something that I've felt in my own ministry. This is something that I think everybody has felt at some point. And I guess the message that I really want to point out to you is that you're not enough. Moses was not enough. And this is a message that's not very common in the modern Christian world. The modern Christian world, it seems like so many times it's like they want to, like, preachers and teachers want to teach these messages of like, you're good enough, you're enough, you're the star of the show, and it's couldn't be further from the truth. When it comes to the calling that God gives you, you're not enough. That's kind of the whole point. You're not good enough. You're not spiritual enough. You probably don't know enough. You might not be confident. There are so many areas where you fail, and the point is that you have to rely on God. Moses wasn't enough, and neither are you. God is enough, and that's the point. Without God, the Israelites would have never made it out of Egypt. The 10 plagues would have never happened. The parting of the Red Sea would have never happened. The 10 Commandments would have never happened. Bringing forth water from a rock would have never happened. Getting to the promised land would have never happened. Like, literally none of it would have happened if it wasn't for God. But Moses had God, and God was enough. And so as you think about your own calling for your own life, it's easy to build ourselves up and say, you know what? I've earned it. I've done the work. I've done all these different things, this, that, and the other. I've earned it. I am enough. But I want you to understand you're not enough. When it comes to the calling that God gives you, it forces us to rely on Him. We talked about it recently, like when it comes to purpose, like sitting at the feet of Jesus is so important to the Christian walk. And I think of my calling of like ministry, it's like if I don't sit at His feet as consistently as possible, my ministry fails. That's true for every calling. Doesn't matter whether you're in ministry, you're a teacher, or you're a cop, or whatever you're doing, whatever way that God has led you to fulfill the Great Commission, it requires God. You alone are simply not enough, and that's the point. It forces us to rely on God. The second excuse that Moses brings up comes from Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. Moses answered, "What if they don't believe me and will not obey me, but say, 'The Lord didn't appear to you'?" Which is a valid thing to ask. Like, what if I tell them all these things? What if I tell the Israelites all these different things, that they're going to be led out of Egypt and all this stuff? And what if they don't believe me? What if they don't obey me? In other words, it's almost like Moses is asking, like, what are the people going to think? What are the people going to think? And that's a very real thing. When it comes to calling, it can be very easy to look at the calling that God leads us to and ask ourselves, what about everybody else? What if I get made fun of? What if I lose my job? What if I lose family members and friendships? Those are very real possibilities. And it's this fear of rejection that so often stops us from doing what God has set out for us to do. It's a fear of rejection that shows up in Moses' life. It's like, what if people make fun of you? What if you stand out? What if you crash and burn? But once again, when we realize that God is with us, this fear all of a sudden is diminished. I'm reminded of the story of Peter walking on water. They're all out in this boat. They look out, it's storming. They see what they think is a ghost. Turns out it's Jesus. And Peter says, if it's really you, Jesus, like, tell me to come out of the water and I'll walk on water to you. So Jesus tells him, come out of the water. And so here you have Peter. He climbs out of this boat. And he starts walking towards water. He has his eyes locked on Jesus. And it's not until he begins to look at the wind and the waves and the storm and the thunder that all of a sudden he starts to sink. And it's the same thing for our lives. It's like we've been given a calling, and we're called out into the water. And when we're locked onto Jesus, when our eyes are fixated on him, when we're following him, it's one thing. But then all of a sudden, we start to notice the people around us. The people who don't like what we're doing, who don't like what we're saying, the people who we consider friends, who all of a sudden stop supporting us. And it's like, oh my goodness, like that anxiety of like social pressure, of like, I feel this pressure to conform is a very real thing. But we have to remember, we're not fulfilling God's calling because the world around us wants us to. In other words, we're not serving the world. We're not working to please the world. Instead, we have an audience of one. It's simply, how can I serve God? How can I please God? What does God want from my life? And when we stay locked in on him, when our eyes are locked on Jesus, those fears of what people think slowly die away. The third excuse that Moses brings up comes from chapter 4, verse 10. It says, but Moses replied to the Lord, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, either in the past or recently or since you've been speaking to your servant, because my mouth and my tongue are sluggish. In other words, Moses isn't just looking at his identity like he was in chapter 3, verse 11. He's now looking at his skill set. He's saying, like, I don't have this skill set. My mouth, my tongue, it's like I can't, I've never been a good speaker. He points to his own weakness. He points to his own inability to speak well. And once again, this sounds like us. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to Christians and about like evangelism or telling people about Jesus, and it's like, well, I don't know enough, or I don't have a degree, or I can't speak well. I'm not a public speaker, or I'm not confident. Like, there's so many times when it comes to evangelism that it's like, I don't have the skill set required to fulfill this task. But what's God's response to Moses in this situation? God said, who placed a mouth on humans? Who makes a person mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. In other words, like, Moses is pointing to his inability, to his own lack of skill set, and God is telling him, I'm with you. Doesn't matter that you lack the skills required to tell people about Jesus or to do your calling. It doesn't matter. I am with you. And that's all that matters. That's something that's really hard to wrap our heads around, because when we step out, when we try to follow Jesus, there's so many times when we do have those thoughts of like, man, I just don't have what it takes. I don't have those skills required. But it doesn't matter. It just doesn't. I'm kind of reminded like Phil Robertson and the Robertson family. I love those people. They're great. Love them to death. But if you really think about it, they're not anything special in the worldly sense. They're just regular people who loved Jesus and loved hunting of all things. And then God used that to spread the gospel to thousands of people, maybe even millions. Your skill set doesn't matter. What you can and can't do doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're with God or not. The last one, the last excuse. Chapter 4, verse 13, Moses said, "Please, Lord, send someone else." In other words, I just don't want to do it. This isn't for me. And to me, this one really hits home. This excuse really hits home for me because this isn't insecurity. It's not fear. Sometimes when we're called by God, it's just plain old reluctance. It's like we often know what we should do, but we just don't want to. We know it'll be difficult. We know that we don't want to put up with the hassle. We know that we don't want to go through the pain that God is calling us into. Yes, sometimes God calls people into painful situations. The truth is, God is patient, but He still expects obedience. At some point, calling simply comes down to a yes or a no. So Moses thought his calling was about his ability, but God showed him that it was about obedience. And this is the key when it comes to calling that I think we should really take a moment to reflect on. It has nothing to do with your ability. It simply has to do with your obedience. Moses, like I said earlier, Moses couldn't part the Red Sea. Moses couldn't do the plagues. Moses was unqualified. Moses was in over his head. This task was way bigger than anything Moses could do. It had nothing to do with ability. And it had everything to do with simply obeying God. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just need to follow through in obedience to what God is calling you to. We just need to do the next right thing in obedience to God and watch our calling unfold right before our eyes. But here's the thing. A lot of times when we think about calling, we think about these great moments of grandeur and attention and being front and center and being in the spotlight like Moses or David or Abraham or Elijah or the apostles, or like maybe in a modern context, like big name preachers or the Robertson family, or like whoever it is that might have a big platform and a big following. But that's not always the case. And more often than not, it's not the case. Think about all the people who lived during the times of Scripture and how many were actually written about. If you're expecting your calling to lead to more attention on you and to lead to more of a spotlight for you, it's very possible that you might be mistaken. Now, there are times when people do end up with a platform and people do end up with status. But more often than not, that's not the case. A great example of that is two characters that you probably forgot about. Maybe you haven't even heard of them. A lot of people haven't heard of these people. A lot of people have read through a lot of the Bible, but somehow missed or have forgotten these two characters. But what's crazy about it is I love these two characters because while they're mundane, maybe, while they're ordinary, they take their calling seriously. And because they took their calling seriously, and because they followed through in obedience, great things came from it. Their names are Bezalel and Oholiab. Bezalel and Oholiab, they can be found just shortly after Exodus 3 in Exodus chapter 35. And they weren't called to do miracles. They weren't called to lead people. They weren't called to have a platform. They weren't called to speak. They were simply called to use their hands and the skills that God gave them. They didn't get status. They didn't get fame. Well, they didn't get much of anything for it. But they obeyed nonetheless. It's in Exodus chapter 35, Starting in verse 30, it said, Moses then said to the Israelites, look, the Lord has appointed by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. He has filled him with God's Spirit and with wisdom, understanding, and ability in every kind of craft to design artistic works in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut gemstones for mounting, and to carve wood for work in every kind of artistic craft. He's also given both him and Oholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, the ability to teach others. He has filled them with skill to do all the work of a gem cutter, a designer, an embroiderer in blue, purple, scarlet yarn, and fine linen, and a weaver. They can do every kind of craft and design artistic designs. Bezalel, Oholiab, and all the skilled people are to work based on everything the Lord has commanded. The Lord has given them wisdom and understanding to know how to do all the work of constructing the sanctuary. And so, in other words, keep in mind, the Israelites at this point are wandering through the wilderness. And God told them to create, really, it's called the Tabernacle. And what the Tabernacle is, like a portable temple. And they took it around wherever they went. And it had this outer area, like this courtyard area. They could perform sacrifices there. They had a holy place. And then after that, separated by this massive curtain, was the most holy place. And once a year, one high priest could enter the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, and there he would encounter God. That was created by the hands of Bezalel and Oholiab. As they would travel through the wilderness, they would set up the tabernacle wherever they went, and they would worship God there. None of that would have happened if Bezalel and Oholiab hadn't taken their calling seriously. It could have been very easy for them to look at that calling and say, well, wait a second, what's in it for me? What do I get out of this deal? Am I going to get status or fame or wealth or anything? No, you're simply called to use your hands and build a sanctuary. And that's an amazing thing. Because, think about your calling. So often we think, I talk to students all the time, and I love it because they get the world ahead of them, and they're so optimistic. And it's think about your calling. What are you being called to do? It's well, I'm being called into to be this job or that job, or do this and that, and go to this school, and go to this college, and get this degree, and all that stuff. Sometimes we're just called to be a really good dad. And sometimes we're just called to be a really good mom if you're a woman. Sometimes we're just called to be really good spouses and to be the best employees that we can be wherever we end up going, or the best entrepreneur that we can be. Sometimes we're just called to be active, serving members of the church. Sometimes we're just called to be the hands and feet of Jesus. It's not always going to be this calling that leads to a following and a platform and status. Sometimes the calling is simply, hey, I have these tasks right in your immediate life that I need you to take care of. I'm calling you to love your kids today. I'm calling you to be present with your kids and with your spouse. I'm calling you to put in the extra time at work to show your boss that you have his back and that you care about him. I'm calling you to find the people at church who need help and just be the hands and feet of Jesus to them. Your calling isn't always going to lead to glory for yourself. But your calling should absolutely lead to glory for God. So if I were to leave you with two things for this video: one, your calling starts with obedience. It starts with obedience. Doesn't matter how big or small the calling might be, you still have to obey nonetheless. So what areas in your life do you need to obey And then the second thing I want you to take with you as you go throughout your week, your calling's not always going to be big, but the God who gives us that calling is big. The God who gives us that calling is worthy of that obedience regardless of what the calling might be. Whether it brings you joy or it brings you sorrow, whether it's fun or whether it's painful, that calling still comes from a great and beautiful God. Obedience is required, not because the calling, but because the God who called us into it. That's all I got this week. Tight lines. I'll see you next time.